IP addresses. Well, what if you actually need 1,000 of them assigned to 1,000 different machines? How do you do that? Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
One of the services that are out there that help us to manage IP addresses easily is going to be DHCP. Well, let's learn more about it from Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, what are we going to be diving into?
Sure. Well, that really pretty much sums it up. We're going to look at identify some of the key attributes of the dynamic host configuration protocol and kind of explain how it can help ease the administrative burden of assigning IP addresses in large numbers. And that's what we're going to look at in this episode.
All right, it's time to get started. Head on over to the bench.
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me. And one of the first things we want to talk about really is just what is DHCP? What does DHCP do for us? Well, DHCP is a service that I would say, is probably just as popular as something like DNS. It's a very important service. What it allows us to do, essentially, is distribute IP addresses in a way in which we do not have to go manually from computer to computer to computer assigning a variety of IP addresses. That is something that is essentially known as static IP address assignment. And it requires a lot of configuration on our part. So one of the things that I would keep in mind here is knowing the difference between static assignment and dynamic assignment. I want to take a second, and what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about what I mean when I say dynamic versus static assignments, all right? When I say static assignment, what I mean here is that we have to go from network adapter to network adapter via machine to machine, and we have to do what? We have to sign, and let me show you, right? If we are doing manual entry of this information to allow computers to connect to networks, then essentially what we are doing is we have to assign an IP address, a subnet mask, a default gateway, and a DNS server so that we can do name resolution, right? This is what is known as manual or static assignment. All right, manual because I had to enter this information, static because it doesn't change until I come back in here and change it. All right, now, if I did this for just one machine, it's probably not too bad, right? If I did this for two machines, we're still okay. You start getting in beyond 2, 3, 4, 5 machines, and then it becomes more complex. And the other thing, too, is there is a chance that there would be misconfiguration through inconsistencies. Can you imagine if you had to do this, like Ronnie mentioned, to 1,000 devices? If you're getting paid by the hour, that's fine. Chances are, you might not want to be doing that if you're getting paid salary. And that's where the dynamic host configuration protocol comes in. It allows us to obtain an IP address automatically. All right, and all I would have to do is I would just switch this over, and this would change this from a static assignment to what we call a dynamic assignment. And that's kind of the high-level overview of dynamic host configuration protocol. I want you to think of the words within that protocol. Dynamic means we can do this on the fly. It means things can change. Host configuration. We configure our host. Most commonly, what I want you to know is that when my computer calls out to the network and needs an IP address, it's going to receive that configuration from the DHCP server. I also want you to understand that this is what's known as a client-driven initiation. My computer, the client, is reaching out to the network and saying, I need an IP address. That is something to understand, that this is a client-initiated protocol.
Yeah, this particular aspect of DHCP is probably one of the most helpful things that we can have, especially when your network is large and changing a lot of times. So by using something like DHCP, it will help us to manage those. If they're all static assignments, it means that any change that happens, let's say that we end up changing the default gateway. I couldn't remember what it's called. We changed the default gateway on one of our networks here. That means those other 999 of them also have to change, and that means we have to go behind and change those again. Dynamic host configuration protocol as a server means we also get to configure it in one place, and then those changes over time or by rebooting the machine can also, of course, show up very easily as well. All right, so Wes, once we actually get that aspect of it down, what else do we need to know?
Sure, Ronnie. So when we obtain that IP address, right, our computers call out to the network, say, hey, I need an IP address, and the DHCP server responds back to us when we get that IP address. It's interesting. We don't have it indefinitely. It's kind of like a rental car company. I call the rental car company and I say, hey, let's say I'm going to be in Boston for a week and I need a car so I can get around, right? So what do I do if I need that car? I call the rental car company and I acquire that rental car for that week. After the end of that week, I have to return the car back to the rental car company, right? Well, that's kind of how a DHCP lease works. So I've got a computer here that has a DHCP address set. Let me go ahead and launch up our PowerShell and we will look at it here. So if I run a utility called ipconfig and I do a space/all, you're going to see, boy, we get a whole bunch of information, and I realize that. But what I'm looking at is this section right here. This information is vital to understanding what a lease is. Notice that I have a lease that is obtained, and it tells me when it was obtained. And then it also tells me that, hey, this lease expires, and it expires at a certain time. All right? Well, that's essentially what a DHCP lease is. When my computer called out to the network and said, hey, I need an IP address, and I obtained one from a DHCP server, the DHCP server marked that in its database and said, okay, your IP address lease starts at this time, and it's going to end at this time. Now, a little bit of transparency here. If I can maintain communication with that DHCP server, the lease will keep renewing, all right, unless there's a reconfiguration. And that would be me saying, hey, I got to stay another week in Boston, right? I'm going to need to be there 2 weeks. So I call the rental car company back and I say, hey, can I extend that lease? Here's my credit card information, extend the lease. And they say, well, sure, we'll extend the lease for another week. That is kind of how your DHCP lease works when you obtain an IP address from one of the servers.
Yeah, the idea of that lease really allows us to reuse those addresses because during that period of time, right, you may actually have some machines that are actively using the network for 24 hours a day. But there's a lot of times where somebody might just be connecting for an hour a day, and if we don't have that lease period time in there, it means they'll still keep that address that entire time normally. So what we want is that ability to yank that address. I say normally, you know, it actually will keep it forever. We don't have a lease time there, but it will actually allow us then in our network here, after about 7 or 8 hours, to essentially see if that address is still being requested. If it's not, to be able to pull that back and reassign that address if we need to. So Wes, can you also help us to understand that process a little bit better though?
Oh, most definitely. So we're talking about the DHCP lease process, and it's really a 4-step process when we talk about the DHCP lease process. And there's a little acronym, like Ronnie said, imagine that, IT acronyms, here we go, that it will help you to remember it, and it's called DORA. That's D as in dog, O as in, let's say, help me out, I don't want to say Omicron here,
Oscar.
but there we go,
Oscar.
Oscar, thank you very much, right? R as in Romeo and A as in Alpha, so DORA, right? And each one of those letters represents one of the 4 steps. So let's talk about the first step, all right? When my computer, I said, calls out to the network and says, hey, is there anybody out there listening? I need an IP address. Well, that's called a discover packet. That's the D in DORA. And it just means that my client is trying to call out to the network and say, hey, is anybody out there? Well, there is a chance that we could have more than one DHCP server on a network. A lot of times you only have one, but in larger environments, you might have more than one. So the O is offer. All right, when we talk about offer, any DHCP server that hears that request is going to respond back and say, hey, here's your IP address with other options, configurations like your gateway, your subnet mask, your DNS server. Here's your configuration package. That's the offer. The R is a request. Now, the request gets a little confusing, and I remember when I was starting out and I didn't understand. The request is the client requesting the configuration package. And you might say, well, Ronnie, Wes, didn't it try to do that with a discover packet? Not really. What it's saying is that the first DHCP server that responds back to me, I'm going to take your configuration package. That's the request. Tell the first DHCP server that responds. The final part of this is an acknowledgement, all right? Acknowledge. And what that means is the acknowledgement says the DHCP server that received that request says, I'm going to give this client this IP address, and I will mark that in my database with a timestamp on it, and the lease starts from there. And that also lets all other DHCP servers out there know, hey, The client took that offer. So they go ahead and they say, yeah, well, we can use what we offered for other clients that come online. So that's the discover, that's the offer, request, and acknowledge. Let me show you here. So for instance, if I run an IP config now, this computer does not have an IPv4 address, does not have an IP address. But I can actually do an IP config space / renew, and that's short for renewing the lease itself. And what it's going to do is it's going to call out to the network and it's going to start that DORA process. It's doing that in the background, just like we've seen it. And then the offer came back from the DHCP server, the request went back to the server via the client, and then finally the DHCP server says, I acknowledge it, here's it in the database, and if we rerun that all, we can now see that we have an updated lease, if you will, on a new IP address. Whether the IP address changes or not is really up to how the DHCP server is configured. But that is your lease process, and I'd be able to identify that.
Now, Wes, how do we actually set what IP addresses to assign there? Because it sounds like we can actually assign every IP address if possible.
You know, we could. If we wanted to, we could assign every IP address within a network range. However, that's not always what we do. We set up what's known as a scope. Now, I don't want you to think that a DHCP scope is this highly technical jargon. Let me show you what I mean. A scope, if you will, is really a range of IP addresses that is configured on the DHCP server. All right? And it says within that scope, I have an address pool. I have these many IP addresses to lease out. All right? I can also see what addresses are being leased. I do want to just talk briefly about something else. Just keep in mind that the scope is the range of IP addresses that we can use, and then within that scope, we can assign different configuration parameters. Notice this one right here, Ronnie, this one that says reservation. Reservation is interesting because one of the things we introed this episode with was the fact that statically mapping a whole bunch of IP addresses is a very manual process. So is there an in-between solution that we can use? And that's where these reservations come in handy, all right? Because what I can say is within that scope, I have, let's say, 2 addresses, one that I want to go to one printer and one that I want to go to another device, and every time it comes online, it starts that DORA process and says, anybody got an IP address out there? This DHCP responds and says, yes, I've got this specific IP address, just like reservations at a restaurant, that is reserved just for you. This IP, if you will, table is reserved for you, and that's the one you're going to get every single time you come online. So it is a way that we can actually control through reservation which IP addresses go to which machines in cases where we want to control that. That is a scope, and that is the reservations. I would keep those in mind if you're in a certification endeavor. It's going to help you on the exam, but it's also going to help you if you need to troubleshoot or support DHCP clients within a help desk environment.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.